The gasps echoed through the dry goods store in Fort Benton, Montana, like a gust of wind through canyon walls, and Caroline Zimmerman knew exactly what had caused them even before she turned around. She had loosened the laces of her corset that morning until the confining garment hung nearly useless beneath her simple cotton dress, allowing her ribs to expand fully for the first time in weeks, and apparently someone had noticed the scandalous difference in her silhouette. "That woman won't wear a corset proper," Mrs. Henrietta Caldwell declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass as she stood near the bolts of fabric with two other respectable ladies of the town. The year was 1876, and in Fort Benton, propriety was as rigid as the whalebone stays that were supposed to cinch a woman's waist to impossible dimensions. Caroline felt heat rush to her cheeks, but she refused to turn around and acknowledge the judgment being passed on her. Instead, she continued examining the sack of flour she'd been considering, her fingers gripping the rough burlap perhaps a bit tighter than necessary. She had come to Montana Territory 6 months ago to teach at the small schoolhouse, leaving behind Boston and all its suffocating expectations, yet somehow the corset had followed her 2,000 miles west. "It is absolutely indecent," another voice chimed in, belonging to Mrs. Florence Bennett. "What kind of example does she set for the young girls in her classroom?" The third woman, whose name Caroline did not know, made a disapproving sound. "I heard she actually went riding last week." Riding. A schoolteacher, gallivanting about the countryside like some common frontier woman. Caroline finally turned to face them, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. "Ladies," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt in her hands, "I assure you that my students learn reading, writing, and arithmetic quite well, regardless of what undergarments I choose to wear." Mrs. Caldwell's face turned an impressive shade of crimson. "Well, I never. The absolute nerve." The bell above the store's door chimed, interrupting the brewing confrontation, and Caroline felt the entire atmosphere in the room shift. She glanced toward the entrance and found herself staring at the largest man she had ever seen in her 22 years of life. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, his shoulders so broad they nearly spanned the width of the doorway. His hair was dark brown, longer than was fashionable in Boston, touching his shoulders in waves that suggested he cut it himself without much concern for style. His beard was neatly trimmed, framing a strong jaw and lips that looked surprisingly soft compared to the hard angles of the rest of his face. But it was his eyes that caught Caroline's attention, a deep green that reminded her of the pine forests that carpeted the mountains surrounding the town. He wore buckskin trousers and a shirt that strained across his chest and arms, revealing muscles that spoke of a life spent wrestling with nature itself. A rifle was slung across his back, and he carried a bundle of furs under one arm with the ease most men might carry a loaf of bread. "Afternoon, Silas," the storekeeper called from behind the counter, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "Got some pelts for me?" The mountain man. This had to be one of the legendary mountain men Caroline had heard about but never actually seen, nodded once and walked to the counter with a stride that was surprisingly quiet for someone his size. His boots barely made a sound on the wooden floorboards. "Beaver, mostly," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in Caroline's chest. "Some mink, all prime quality." Caroline realized she was staring and forced herself to look away, but not before the mountain man's gaze swept across the room and landed on her for a brief, electric moment. His expression revealed nothing, but something in those green eyes made her breath catch in her throat. Caldwell, apparently emboldened by the presence of another witness to Caroline's impropriety, spoke up again. "Mr. Harper, as a respected member of this community, despite your chosen profession, perhaps you can speak some sense into our schoolteacher here. She refuses to dress properly, and it is causing quite the scandal." The mountain man, Mr. Harper, apparently set his bundle of furs on the counter and turned his full attention to the cluster of gossiping women. His gaze moved from them to Caroline, taking in her simple dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, and yes, the notably unlaced corset beneath her clothing. "Seems to me a woman's undergarments are her own business," he said, his tone flat but carrying an edge that made Mrs. Caldwell's mouth snap shut. "Cannot see how it affects the quality of her teaching." It is about decency and maintaining civilized standards, Mrs. Bennet protested, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Surely even you can understand that, Mr. Harper. Something flickered in the mountain man's eyes, amusement perhaps, or annoyance. I understand that in the 8 years I have lived in these mountains, I have seen more death from women wearing those contraptions than from grizzly bears. Cannot breathe, cannot move, cannot live proper. Seems to me if a woman wants to breathe easy, she has earned that right. The silence that followed was absolute. Caroline felt as though the entire world had narrowed to this moment, to this unexpected defense from a man who looked like he could wrestle bears, but spoke with a conviction that suggested he had thought deeply about things most men ignored. Well, Mrs. Caldwell finally managed, her face now approaching purple. I see there is no reasoning with either of you. Come, ladies, we shall discuss this matter with the school board. The three women swept out of the store in a rustle of perfectly corseted skirts, the bell above the door jangling violently with their departure. Caroline stood frozen, unsure whether to thank this stranger or flee before the full weight of what had just happened crashed down upon her. The mountain man turned back to the storekeeper, apparently considering the matter closed. Need some coffee beans, Silas, and sugar, if you have it. Of course, Silas said, scurrying to gather the requested items. That will be $3 for the lot, including credit for your furs. Caroline knew she should leave, should go back to the small cabin she rented behind the schoolhouse, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The mountain man collected his purchases, nodded to Silas, and turned toward the door. He paused when he reached Caroline, those green eyes meeting hers directly. Up close, she could see the faint scars on his hands, the weathered texture of his skin from years spent exposed to wind and sun. He smelled of pine trees and wood smoke, and something wild she could not name. They will make trouble for you, he said quietly, for her ears only. The school board listens to women like Mrs. Caldwell. I know, Caroline replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. But I cannot breathe in those things. I tried. For months I tried, and I felt like I was dying slowly, one constricted breath at a time. Something softened in his expression, so subtle she might have imagined it. Then you made the right choice. Sometimes living proper means different things to different people. Thank you, she said, the words feeling inadequate for what he had done. For speaking up. You did not have to. Could not stand by and let them shame you for choosing to breathe, he said simply. He tipped his head in a gesture that was not quite a bow, but held a certain old-fashioned courtesy. Adam Harper, miss. I trap in the mountains north of here. Caroline Zimmerman, she replied, extending her hand without thinking. In Boston, a lady would never shake hands with a man, but this was Montana, and the rules seemed different here. His hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused and gentle despite its size. The contact lasted only a moment, but Caroline felt it down to her toes. Good day, Miss Zimmerman, he said, and then he was gone, ducking through the doorway and out into the bright October afternoon. Caroline stood in the suddenly quiet store, her hand still tingling from his touch, wondering what on earth had just happened. He is a good man, that one, Silas said from behind the counter, making Caroline jump. She had almost forgotten the storekeeper was there. Lives alone up in the mountains most of the year. Only comes down for supplies every few weeks. Been doing it since he arrived here in '68. Never causes trouble, always pays fare, and he once carried Mrs. Peterson's sick boy 5 miles through a snowstorm to fetch the doctor. Caroline processed this information, filing it away in her mind alongside the memory of green eyes and a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. He seems unusual, she finally said. Silas chuckled. That he is. Now, were you planning to purchase that flower or just hold it hostage all afternoon? Caroline looked down and realized she was still clutching the sack of flour. She laughed, a genuine sound that eased some of the tension from her shoulders. Yes, please, and perhaps some tea if you have any. As Silas rang up her purchases, Caroline's mind drifted back to Adam Harper's words. She breathes easy with me. He had not said those exact words, but the implication had been there, in his defense of her choice, in his understanding of why she had loosened her corset. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant golden across the wide Missouri River when Caroline finally left the store, her purchases tucked into the basket she carried. Fort Benton spread along the river's edge, a town that served as the head of navigation for steamboats and the jumping-off point for trappers, miners, and traders heading into the wilderness. It was rough and practical, built of wood and determination, so different from the brick and propriety of Boston. She walked the 3 blocks to the schoolhouse, a simple structure that also housed her living quarters in a small room at the back. The children would arrive tomorrow morning, all 15 of them ranging from age 6 to 14, and she needed to prepare lessons. But when she reached her door, she found a note tacked to it written in Mrs. Caldwell's precise script. Miss Zimmerman, the school board will convene tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock to discuss your continued employment. Your attendance is required. Caroline's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but the speed of it still surprised her. Less than 2 hours had passed since the incident in the store, and already they were moving to dismiss her. She went inside and set her basket on the small table, then sank into the room's only chair. Through the window, she could see the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Somewhere up there, Adam Harper was probably returning to his cabin, unburdened by the social constraints that threatened to cost Caroline her livelihood. The unfairness of it struck her forcefully. She was a good teacher. Her students learned. Their reading scores had improved dramatically since she had taken over from the previous teacher, an elderly man who had spent more time napping than instructing. But none of that mattered as much as whether she compressed her ribs into a shape deemed acceptable by women who had likely never questioned a single rule in their lives. Caroline stood and paced the small room, her mind racing. She could apologize, could promise to lace her corset tighter, could bend to their will and keep her position. The thought made her feel sick. She had not come all this way, had not left behind everything familiar just to trade one set of chains for another. Or she could stand firm, could defend her choice and likely lose her position. Then what? Return to Boston in disgrace? Try to find another teaching position in another town where the same expectations would follow her? She was still wrestling with these questions when night fell, and she was no closer to an answer when she finally fell into a restless sleep. The next day passed in a blur of lessons and worried glances from some of her students, who had clearly heard their parents discussing the scandal. Caroline taught with her usual dedication, refusing to let her personal troubles interfere with the children's education. But when the final student departed at 3 o'clock, the dread she had been holding at bay all day came rushing back. She had 4 hours until the school board meeting. She used the time to prepare, rehearsing what she would say, trying to find words that were both honest and diplomatic. When 7 o'clock approached, she put on her best dress still worn without a properly laced corset and walked to the town hall with her head high. The board consisted of 5 men, all prominent businessmen in Fort Benton. They sat behind a long table, their faces grave. Mrs. Caldwell and her companions sat in chairs along the wall, looking triumphant. A handful of other townspeople had also gathered, drawn by the promise of scandal. "Miss Zimmerman," the board chairman, Mr. Frederick Thornton, began, "we have heard serious complaints regarding your conduct and appearance. The concerns are that you are not maintaining proper standards of dress and decency expected of a schoolteacher. How do you respond?" Caroline took a breath, willing her voice to remain steady. "Gentlemen, I am aware that some in this community take issue with my choice to loosen my corset. I made this decision because the standard practice of tight lacing was affecting my health. I could not breathe properly, I had frequent headaches, and I found it difficult to move about the classroom as my teaching requires. Since making this change, my health has improved dramatically, and I believe my teaching has as well." "That is all well and good," Mr. Thornton replied, "but you must understand that as a teacher, you are held to a higher standard. You are a role model for young girls in this community." "I hope I am a role model," Caroline said, her voice gaining strength. "I hope I am teaching them that education matters, that their minds are valuable, and that they should think for themselves. If I am also teaching them that a woman's health and comfort are worth considering, I cannot see how that is a negative lesson." Mrs. Caldwell made a sound of outrage, but Mr. Thornton held up a hand to silence her. "Miss Zimmerman, we appreciate your dedication to teaching, but—" The door to the town hall opened, Interrupting him, Adam Harper stepped inside, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He was cleaned up from the day before, his hair pulled back, wearing a shirt that was obviously his best, though still made of simple homespun. Every eye in the room turned to him. "Mr. Harper," Mr. Thornton said, clearly surprised, "this is a closed meeting." "Heard you were deciding Miss Zimmerman's fate," Adam said, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. "Thought you might want another perspective." "This is highly irregular," Mrs. Caldwell protested. Adam ignored her, his attention fixed on the board members. "You all know me. I do not come to town much, do not involve myself in politics or social matters, but I'm here tonight because I saw something yesterday that troubled me." He moved further into the room, and Caroline noticed that despite his size and the potential threat he could represent, his movements were careful, controlled. He was making himself less intimidating, she realized, trying not to overwhelm the space. "I saw a woman being shamed for making a choice about her own body, about her own health," Adam continued. "I have lived in these mountains for 8 years. In that time, I have pulled 2 women from the river who fainted and fell in because their corsets were laced too tight. I've helped carry a woman having a miscarriage because her baby could not grow proper with her insides compressed. I've watched women struggle to breathe, to move, to live, all because society tells them they must torture themselves to be considered decent." The room was utterly silent. Caroline felt tears prickling at her eyes, moved by this unexpected advocacy. "Miss Zimmerman is a good teacher," Adam said, looking directly at each board member in turn. "Your children are learning. Their parents should be grateful for that, not concerned about what undergarments she wears. If you dismiss her for choosing health over appearance, you are telling every girl in that schoolhouse that her value lies in how small she can make her waist, not how much she can expand her mind. Is that truly the lesson you want to teach?" Mr. Thornton cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Harper, we appreciate your input, but surely you can understand that there are standards of propriety that must be maintained." "Propriety," Adam repeated, and there was something hard in his voice now. "I wonder if those same standards of propriety would have saved Mary Hendricks 3 years ago when she collapsed in the summer heat because her corset would not let her breathe, or Susan Walsh, who broke 2 ribs when she fell from her horse, and the breaks took twice as long to heal because the corset kept pressing on them." Mrs. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Susan Walsh was her cousin. "What I'm asking," Adam said, his voice softening slightly, "is that you consider what truly matters here. Ms. Zimmerman is not harming anyone. She is helping children learn. She is doing good work. If she needs to breathe easy to do that work well, then let her breathe easy. There are enough real dangers in this territory without creating artificial ones." He stepped back, nodded once to the board, and then his eyes found Caroline's. In them, she saw understanding, support, and something else that made her heart skip. "That is all I have to say," he said. Then he turned and left the hall as quietly as he had entered. The silence that followed was profound. Caroline could see the board members exchanging glances, could see Mrs. Caldwell's outraged expression, could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. Finally, Mr. Thornton spoke. "The board will deliberate and provide our decision tomorrow. Miss Zimmerman, you are dismissed." Caroline walked out of the town hall on shaking legs. The night air was cold, promising frost, but she barely felt it. She looked around for Adam but saw no sign of him. He had vanished back into the darkness, a guardian appearing and disappearing like something from a fairy tale. She made her way home and spent another restless night, though this time her thoughts were less about fear and more about a mountain man with green eyes who spoke of women breathing easy. The next morning, as Caroline was beginning lessons with her students, a boy arrived with a note from Mr. Thornton. She opened it with trembling hands while her students watched with wide eyes. "Miss Zimmerman, after careful consideration, the board has decided to continue your employment. However, we strongly encourage you to consider community standards in your personal choices. Your contract will be reviewed again at the end of the school term." It was not a complete victory, but it was not a defeat either. Caroline felt relief wash through her, followed quickly by gratitude for Adam Harper's intervention. Without his testimony, she was certain the outcome would have been different. She folded the note carefully and smiled at her students. "All right, children, let us continue with our reading lesson." The day passed in its normal rhythm, but Caroline's mind kept drifting to the mountains north of town. She wanted to thank Adam properly, but she had no idea where to find him or when he might return to Fort Benton. As it turned out, she did not have to wait long. 3 days later, on Saturday, Caroline was working in the small garden plot behind the schoolhouse, trying to harvest the last of the vegetables before the first hard freeze. She was on her knees, digging up carrots, when a shadow fell across her. She looked up to find Adam Harper standing there, holding a fresh-killed deer across his shoulders as easily as if it weighed nothing. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle, and his hair was loose around his face. "Mr. Harper," she said, getting quickly to her feet and brushing dirt from her skirts. Her heart was suddenly racing. "I was hoping I would see you again. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did at the board meeting." He set the deer down carefully on the grass. "Heard you kept your position. That's good." "Only because of you," Caroline said. "Your testimony made the difference. I am certain of it." Adam shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Only spoke the truth. They needed to hear it." "Still, you did not have to come. You did not have to get involved. Most people would not have. Most people are willing to stand by and watch injustice happen," he said simply. "Never been good at that." Caroline studied him in the afternoon light. This close, she could see details she had missed before the laugh lines around his eyes, suggesting he smiled more than his serious demeanor would indicate, the small scar on his chin, the way his hands, so large and capable, moved with surprising gentleness. "Ma, I brought you something," he said, gesturing to the deer. "Winter is coming on, and a teacher's salary probably does not leave much for extra meat. This should keep you fed for a good while if you smoke it proper." Caroline stared at the deer, then at Adam, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I cannot possibly accept this. It is too much. Considerate payment for teaching the children," he said, "or thanks for having the courage to stand up for yourself, or just a gift from a neighbor. Whatever makes you comfortable accepting it." "Do you give gifts to all your neighbors?" Caroline asked, a smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she saw Adam's expression shift into something that might have been amusement. "Only the ones brave enough to face down Mrs. Caldwell." Caroline laughed, a genuine, delighted sound. "In that case, I accept with gratitude, though I confess I have no idea how to smoke meat properly." "I could show you," Adam offered, then seemed to realize how that might sound. "If you want, no obligation." Caroline knew she should probably decline. Having a man at her home, teaching her to preserve meat, would likely cause another scandal. But she found she did not care. Adam Harper had stood up for her when no one else would. The least she could do was trust him enough to accept his help. "I would like that very much," she said. They spent the afternoon together, with Adam showing Caroline how to butcher the deer, explaining which cuts were best for smoking and which should be cooked fresh. He worked with practiced efficiency, his knife sharp and his movements sure. Caroline watched and helped where she could, learning quickly, asking questions that he answered with patience. As they worked, they talked. Adam told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands, about the rhythms of trapping and hunting and living according to seasons rather than clocks. Caroline told him about Boston, about leaving behind a life that had felt like a beautiful cage, about the joy she found in teaching children who actually wanted to learn. "Why did you come west?" Adam asked as he showed her how to cut the meat into strips for smoking. "I wanted to breathe," Caroline said, then realized how literally true that was. Not just physically, though, that has certainly become an issue, but I wanted to live in a place where I could make my own choices, where I was valued for what I could do rather than how well I could conform. "And have you found that here?" he asked, his green eyes meeting hers. Caroline considered the question. "I am finding it," she said slowly. "It is harder than I expected. The same expectations followed me west, just in different forms. But when someone like you stands up and says that a woman should be allowed to breathe easy, that gives me hope that real change is possible." Adam was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling in their work. "My mother died when I was 16, he said finally. "Complications from childbirth. The doctor said that years of wearing tight corsets had deformed her ribs, made it hard for her to breathe deep enough during labor. She just ran out of strength." Caroline's breath caught. Adam, I'm so sorry. It was 14 years ago, he said, resuming his work with the meat. But I have never forgotten what the doctor said, that something society claimed was proper and necessary had killed her as surely as any disease. Made me question a lot of other things people claim are necessary. Is that why you became a mountain man, to escape those constraints? Partly, Adam admitted. Also because I like the quiet, like being able to see for miles without buildings blocking the view, like knowing that if I work hard and smart, I can survive without depending on anyone else's approval or permission. That sounds lonely, Caroline said softly. Adam glanced at her and something flickered in his expression. It has been, he said. Mostly I do not mind, but sometimes talking to someone who understands, that is worth more than all the solitude in the world. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Caroline did not have words for. She was acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way his hands moved with such confidence and care. I should get this set up for smoking, Adam said, breaking the moment. You have a smokehouse? There is a small one behind the schoolhouse, Caroline said, trying to steady her suddenly racing heart. The previous teacher used it, though I have not. They spent the next hour setting up the smokehouse with Adam building a fire and showing Caroline how to maintain the right temperature and smoke level. The sun was setting by the time they finished, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the Missouri River. Thank you, Caroline said as Adam prepared to leave. For all of this, the meat, the lessons, the defense at the board meeting. You have been kinder to me than I had any right to expect. Adam picked up his rifle, slinging it across his back with easy familiarity. You are welcome to come up to my cabin sometime, if you want to see the mountains proper. It is about 8 miles north, following the river and then up into the foothills. I will be there most of the winter, only coming down for supplies every few weeks. I would like that, Caroline said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Adam nodded, a small smile crossing his face. Good. Then I will see you again, Caroline Zimmerman. He walked away into the gathering darkness, and Caroline stood watching until he disappeared from view. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the truth that had been growing in her heart all afternoon. She was falling for the mountain man who thought women should breathe easy. The following week slipped into a pattern. Caroline taught her students during the week, and on Saturdays, weather permitting, she would ride the 8 miles north to Adam's cabin. He had been right about the location following the river until it curved east, then heading up into the foothills where pine trees grew thick and the air smelled of resin and earth. The first time she made the journey, her heart pounded with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. What was she doing, riding alone into the wilderness to visit a man she barely knew? But when she emerged into the clearing where Adam's cabin stood, all her doubts evaporated. The cabin was beautiful in its simplicity, built from logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch running along the front. Animal pelts were stretched on frames in the yard, drying in the cold autumn air. A small barn stood nearby, housing 2 horses and a milk cow. The whole place spoke of self-sufficiency and careful planning. Adam emerged from the barn as she dismounted, his face lighting up with a smile that transformed his usually serious expression. "You came," he said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice. "I said I would," Caroline replied, returning his smile. He showed her around his property, explaining how he had chosen this location for its access to water, timber, and game. Inside the cabin, she found a space that was Spartan but comfortable, with a large fireplace, a bed built into one corner, shelves lined with supplies, and a table he had clearly made himself. "It is wonderful," Caroline said, and meant it. There was something appealing about the honesty of this place, the way everything had a purpose and nothing was for show. They spent that first visit walking through the woods, with Adam teaching her to identify animal tracks and showing her the trails the deer used. He pointed out which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which should be avoided. Caroline absorbed it all eagerly, hungry for knowledge that Boston had never offered her. As the weeks passed and winter settled over Montana, their visits became the highlight of Caroline's week. She would ride up on Saturday mornings, and Adam would be waiting, always with something new to show her or teach her. He taught her to shoot his rifle, patiently correcting her stance until she could hit the target more often than not. He showed her how to read the weather and the clouds and the behavior of animals. He told her stories of his years in the mountains, of close calls with bears and wolves, of harsh winters survived and beautiful springs celebrated. In turn, Caroline told him about her students, about the small victories when a child finally understood a difficult concept, about her own education in Boston and the books she loved. She brought books with her sometimes, and they would spend hours reading aloud to each other by the fire, her voice and his taking turns bringing stories to life. It was during one of these afternoons in late November, with snow falling gently outside and the fire crackling warm inside, that something shifted between them. Caroline was reading from a volume of poetry, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the verses, when she looked up to find Adam watching her with an expression that made her lose her place in the text. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You are beautiful when you read," he said simply. "Your whole face lights up with the words." Caroline felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. Adam. He stood from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her so their eyes were level. "I know I should not say things like that. You are a respectable schoolteacher, and I am just a mountain man who lives alone in the wilderness. But I cannot keep pretending that these visits are just about teaching you wilderness skills or sharing books." Caroline's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What are they about, then?" "They are about the fact that I think about you every day you are not here," Adam said, his green eyes intense. "About how I started counting days between Saturdays, about how this cabin, which has felt like enough for 8 years, suddenly feels empty when you leave." "Oh," Caroline breathed, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "If I am wrong, if you do not feel the same way, tell me now and I will never speak of it again," Adam said. "We can go back to just being friends and I will be grateful for that. But if there is any chance you might feel even a fraction of what I feel." Caroline reached out and placed her hand on his cheek, feeling the scratch of his beard against her palm, the warmth of his skin. "You are not wrong," she whispered. "I feel it too. I have been feeling it since the first day you defended me in the store, but I did not dare hope you might feel the same." The smile that spread across Adam's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He covered her hand with his own, turning his head slightly to press a kiss to her palm. The gesture was so tender, so full of restrained emotion, that Caroline felt tears spring to her eyes. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with feeling. "Please," she said. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, but Caroline met him halfway. When their lips touched, it was like coming home to a place she had never been but had always been searching for. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though they were both afraid of breaking something precious. Then Adam's hand came up to cup the back of her head, and Caroline's fingers tangled in his hair, and the kiss deepened into something that made the rest of the world fall away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adam rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Only weeks," Caroline said, a little breathless. "I have wanted it since you told the school board that I should be allowed to breathe easy." Adam laughed, a warm, rich sound that Caroline wanted to hear every day for the rest of her life. "So what do we do now?" he asked. "I am not a man who knows much about courting or social graces." "Neither am I, apparently," Caroline said, gesturing at herself, sitting alone with a man in his cabin, thoroughly unchaperoned. "I suppose we figure it out together." They spent the rest of that afternoon talking, making plans, discussing the practical realities of what a relationship between them would look like. It would not be easy. Adam's life was in the mountains, and Caroline's work was in town. There would be talk, certainly, and likely more disapproval from the likes of Mrs. Caldwell. "I do not care what they say," Caroline declared. "I came to Montana to find freedom, and I found something better. I found you." "We will make it work," Adam promised. "I can come down to town more often, maybe even take on some guide work for the trading company, earn money that way instead of just trapping. Would mean I could be closer to you." "I do not want you to give up the life you love," Caroline protested. "I am not giving it up," Adam said, taking her hands in his. "I am making room in it for something I love more." As winter deepened and 1876 gave way to 1877, Adam and Caroline built their relationship with the same care and attention Adam had used to build his cabin. He did indeed take on guide work, leading trading parties up into the mountains and back, which meant he spent several nights a week in Fort Benton. When he was in town, he and Caroline would have dinner together, carefully observed by Mrs. Caldwell and her compatriots, but no longer caring about their disapproval. Adam met Caroline's students, and they were fascinated by the mountain man who could identify any animal track and knew stories about the wilderness that made their eyes grow wide. He started coming to the schoolhouse once a week to teach lessons about Montana's wildlife and geography, knowledge that was far more relevant to these frontier children than anything Caroline had learned in Boston. Caroline, for her part, continued to thrive as a teacher. Her students' test scores were the highest the school had ever seen, and even the most critical parents had to admit that their children were learning. The corset issue faded into the background, helped by the fact that two other women in town quietly began loosening their own laces, inspired by Caroline's stand. In March, when the first hints of spring began to appear, Adam asked Caroline to marry him. He did it simply, without fanfare, during one of their Saturday visits to his cabin. They were standing on the porch watching the sunset when he turned to her and said, "I want you to be my wife. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to build a life with you, here in these mountains or in town or wherever you want to be, as long as we are together." Caroline's answer was to throw her arms around his neck and kiss him until they were both dizzy with it. "Yes," she said when she could finally speak. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in late April at the small church in Fort Benton, with Caroline's students forming the bulk of the congregation. Caroline wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton, and she did not wear a corset at all. Adam wore his best clothes and looked slightly uncomfortable in anything other than buckskins, but his eyes never left Caroline's face during the entire ceremony. Mrs. Caldwell attended, sitting in the back with her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. But even she could not deny the obvious love between the bride and groom. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Adam kissed his bride with a tenderness that made half the congregation sigh with romantic appreciation, even Mrs. Caldwell had to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. The newlyweds spent their first weeks of marriage figuring out the logistics of their life together. Caroline finished out the school term, teaching through May, while Adam continued his guide work and began building an addition onto his cabin. They decided that Caroline would teach during the school year, living in town during the week and going up to the cabin on weekends. In the summer, she would live at the cabin full-time, helping Adam with his work and enjoying the mountains she had come to love nearly as much as she loved him. It was an unconventional arrangement, but it suited them perfectly. Caroline thrived on having both the intellectual stimulation of teaching and the physical freedom of mountain life. Adam had the solitude he needed for his work, but also the companionship and love he had not realized he was missing. Summer arrived in a burst of wildflowers and warm sunshine, and Caroline moved to the cabin for the season. She had worried that spending all day, every day with Adam might somehow diminish the magic between them, but instead, it only grew stronger. They fell into a rhythm of work and leisure that felt as natural as breathing. Caroline helped Adam with tasks around the property, learning to garden in the mountain soil, to milk the cow, to repair tack and mend clothes. In return, Adam taught her to fish in the cold streams that ran down from the peaks, to track game through the forest, to read the land in ways she had never imagined. On warm afternoons, they would spread a blanket in the meadow near the cabin and lie together, watching clouds drift across the endless Montana sky. Adam would trace patterns on Caroline's arm with one calloused finger and tell her stories about the mountains, about the seasons and the animals, and the way everything connected. "I never knew I could be this happy," Caroline admitted one day in late June, her head resting on Adam's chest as his heartbeat thrummed steady beneath her ear. "I always thought happiness was something you had to fight for, something that came with conditions and compromises, but this feels easy, natural." "That is because you are breathing easy," Adam said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "With me, you can breathe." In August, Caroline discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but wanted to be certain before telling Adam. When she finally shared the news, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply. Adam turned to her, his eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been fear. "Truly, truly. The baby should arrive sometime in early March if my calculations are correct." For a long moment, Adam said nothing. Then he pulled Caroline into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that made her feel infinitely precious. "I will take care of you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you, I swear it." "I know you will," Caroline said, wrapping her arms around him. "I am not afraid." But as the pregnancy progressed and autumn arrived, Adam's worry became more apparent. He had not forgotten his mother's death, and the thought of losing Caroline the same way clearly haunted him. He insisted she see the doctor in Fort Benton regularly, rode into town with her to make sure she did not overexert herself, treated her as though she might break. Finally, in October, Caroline confronted him about it. They were in the cabin, with the first snow of the season falling outside, and Adam was fussing over her yet again, insisting she rest instead of helping prepare dinner. "Adam," she said firmly, "sit down. We need to talk." He sat looking worried. "Are you all right? Is it the baby?" "We are both fine," Caroline said, "but you are driving me mad with all this hovering. I know you are worried. I know you are thinking about your mother. But I am not her, and this is not the same situation." "But what if—" "No," Caroline interrupted. "I will not live the next 5 months in fear of what might happen. Your mother's death was a tragedy, but it was caused by years of corset damage. I have never worn a corset tight enough to cause that kind of harm, and I certainly am not wearing one now. The doctor said I am healthy and strong, that there is every reason to expect a normal delivery." Adam's hands clenched on his knees. "I cannot lose you, Caroline. I would not survive it." Caroline moved to stand in front of him, taking his face in her hands. "You are not going to lose me. I am strong, Adam. You have seen how strong I am. I can ride for miles. I can chop wood. I can handle this. But I need you to trust me and trust my body to do what it was designed to do." "I do trust you," Adam said. "I am just afraid." "So am I," Caroline admitted. "Every woman is afraid before her first child. But we face that fear together, and we trust that everything will be all right. Can you do that for me?" Adam pulled her down onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her carefully. "I will try," he promised. "I will try." They returned to Fort Benton in November, settling into the small house behind the schoolhouse for the winter. Caroline resumed teaching, her pregnancy now visible but not yet interfering with her work. The students were excited about the upcoming baby, the older girls especially full of questions and offers to help. Even Mrs. Caldwell seemed to soften somewhat, coming to the schoolhouse one day in December with a pile of baby blankets she had knitted. "For the child," she said stiffly. "Every baby needs warm blankets." "Thank you," Caroline said, genuinely touched. "This is very kind of you." Mrs. Caldwell sniffed. "Well, you may have unconventional ideas about corsets and propriety, but you are a good teacher, and your husband is a good man. The child will be lucky to have you both." It was perhaps the closest thing to an apology Caroline would ever receive, and she accepted it gracefully. Winter passed slowly, with Adam taking fewer guide jobs and spending most of his time in town with Caroline. He had built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving designs of mountains and trees into the sides. Caroline sewed baby clothes and blankets, preparing the small room that would serve as a nursery. In early March, right on schedule, Caroline went into labor. Adam rode to fetch the doctor, and then paced the floor of the schoolhouse like a caged animal while the doctor and the midwife attended to his wife. He had never felt so helpless, so completely unable to use his strength and skills to protect the person he loved most. The labor was long, nearly 18 hours, but Caroline was indeed strong. When the cry of a baby finally rang through the schoolhouse, Adam burst into the bedroom without waiting for permission. Caroline was propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, looking exhausted but radiant, and in her arms was a tiny red-faced baby with a shock of dark hair. "It is a boy," she said, her voice tired but full of joy. "Adam, we have a son." Adam crossed to the bed on shaking legs, looking down at the impossibly small person his wife held. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Would you like to hold him?" Caroline asked. Adam's hands, which could skin a deer without hesitation and chop wood for hours, trembled as he took his son. The baby was so small that he fit easily in Adam's arms, and when the tiny hand curled around Adam's finger, something in his chest cracked wide open. "Hello, little one," Adam murmured. "I am your father. I'm going to teach you about the mountains and the rivers, about strength and kindness, about treating people with respect. And I'm going to tell you about your mother, about how she is the bravest person I have ever known." Caroline watched them with tears streaming down her face, overcome with love for both her husband and her son. They named the boy Thomas after Adam's father, and he became the center of their world. Caroline took a few months away from teaching to recover and care for the baby. Adam barely left her side those first weeks, still worried despite the successful delivery. But as Caroline's strength returned and baby Thomas grew fat and healthy, Adam's worry gradually eased. They returned to the cabin in June, and Thomas's first summer was spent in the mountains, surrounded by pine trees and fresh air. He was a content baby, rarely fussing, seeming to enjoy the quiet of the wilderness as much as his parents did. Caroline went back to teaching that fall, with Thomas coming to the schoolhouse with her. The students adored having a baby in the classroom, and the older girls would take turns holding him during their lunch break. Adam built a cradle for the schoolhouse so Thomas could nap there, and he continued his guide work, now motivated even more to provide for his growing family. The years passed in a pattern of seasons and growth. Thomas grew from baby to toddler to a sturdy young boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to identify tracks and plants before he could read. Caroline taught during the school years and spent summers in the mountains, her reputation as an educator growing until she was considered one of the best teachers in Montana Territory. In 1880, Caroline gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, a fierce little girl with her mother's auburn hair and her father's green eyes. 3 years later came another son, James, who was quiet and thoughtful like his mother. The cabin grew with additions to accommodate the expanding family, but it never lost the sense of peace and rightness that had characterized it from the beginning. Mrs. Caldwell and her friends gradually came to accept the Harpers, and in fact held them up as an example of a successful frontier family. Other women in Fort Benton began to question the necessity of tight-laced corsets, and by the mid-1880s, it was no longer scandalous to wear them loosely or not at all. Caroline liked to think she had started a small revolution, though Adam insisted it was just common sense, finally prevailing. In 1889, Montana became a state, and Fort Benton celebrated with a huge festival. The Harper family attended, with 12-year-old Thomas, proud to be allowed to carry the Montana flag in the parade. 9-year-old Elizabeth insisted on wearing trousers instead of a dress, a battle Caroline and Adam chose not to fight, having learned that their daughter's stubbornness rivaled their own. 6-year-old James clutched his mother's hand and watched everything with wide, wondering eyes. As the fireworks lit up the sky that night, Caroline leaned against Adam's solid warmth and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come to Montana searching for freedom and had found so much more love, family, purpose, and a life that was entirely her own. "What are you thinking about?" Adam asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "About breathing easy," Caroline said. "About how you were right that first day in the store. About how everything good in my life started the moment I decided I was allowed to breathe." Adam kissed the top of her head. "You were always allowed to breathe, Caroline. You just needed to give yourself permission. And I needed you to defend that choice," she reminded him. "We defended it together," Adam said, "and we built something beautiful from that choice." They stood there watching the fireworks, surrounded by their children and the community that had become their home, and Caroline knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right decisions. The corset had been just the beginning, a symbol of all the constraints she had been willing to shed. But the real freedom had come from finding someone who loved her exactly as she was, who valued her strength and her mind and her courage. Thomas grew up to be a teacher like his mother, though he taught wilderness skills to children across Montana, combining Caroline's love of education with Adam's knowledge of the land. Elizabeth became a doctor, one of the first women doctors in the state, driven by stories of her grandmother's death and a determination that no woman should die from something so preventable. James took over his father's guide business, expanding it into a successful outfitting company that brought hunters and tourists into the Montana wilderness while teaching them to respect and preserve it. Caroline taught for 30 years, retiring in 1906 at the age of 52. By then, she had educated hundreds of children, many of whom went on to become leaders in the young state. Several of her former students became teachers themselves, spreading her methods and philosophy to schools across Montana. Adam gave up trapping in his early 50s, his knees and back finally protesting the years of hard mountain living. But he never gave up the cabin, and he and Caroline spent every summer there, teaching their grandchildren the same lessons they had taught their own children about respect for nature and the importance of living authentically. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1897, Adam gave Caroline a gift that made her cry. It was her old corset from Boston, the one she had finally thrown away years before, which he had retrieved and kept all this time. He had framed it like a piece of art, mounting it in a shadow box with a small brass plaque that read, "She breathes easy with me." "I wanted you to remember," Adam said as Caroline held the frame with shaking hands. "I wanted you to remember what you overcame, what you chose, what you stood up for. You changed this town, Caroline. You changed me. You changed our children. All because you decided you were allowed to breathe." Caroline set the frame aside and pulled her husband into a kiss that still, after 20 years, made her heart race. "I chose to breathe," she agreed, "but you made it safe for me to make that choice. You defended me when no one else would. You loved me when I was too stubborn and unconventional for anyone else to handle." "You were never too anything," Adam said firmly. "You were exactly right, exactly yourself. And that is who I fell in love with." They hung the framed corset in the cabin, where it stayed for the rest of their lives, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. In 1918, Caroline fell ill with pneumonia. She was 64 years old, and despite the care of her daughter, the doctor, her body simply could not fight off the infection. She died peacefully in her sleep at the cabin, with Adam holding her hand and the sound of the wind in the pines outside. Adam followed her 2 years later, at the age of 66. He had spent those 2 years maintaining the cabin and the land, teaching his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but there was a hollowness in him without Caroline that everyone could see. When his heart simply stopped one morning as he sat on the porch watching the sunrise, his children agreed it was because he had been ready to join his wife again. They were buried together in the small cemetery in Fort Benton, their headstone simple: Adam Harper and Caroline Zimmerman. Harper. They breathed easy together. The cabin stayed in the family for generations, maintained carefully as a reminder of the love story that had started with a mountain man defending a woman's right to loosen her corset. The framed corset still hung on the wall, and family members would tell their children the story of how sometimes the smallest act of defiance could lead to the greatest love. In Fort Benton, a historical marker was eventually placed near where the old dry goods store had stood, commemorating Caroline Harper as one of Montana's pioneering educators and early feminists. But those who knew the real story understood that it had never been about feminism or politics or making a statement. It had been about a woman who wanted to breathe and a man who believed she should be allowed to. And in that simple desire for freedom, in that basic defense of a human right, they had found each other and built a love that lasted beyond their lifetimes, inspiring generations to come to live authentically, love deeply, and always, always remember that breathing easy is not just a physical necessity, but a spiritual one. The mountains stood eternal above Fort Benton, and in their shadow, the legacy of Adam and Caroline Harper lived on in the teachers they had inspired, in the children who learned to question unjust constraints, in the women who chose comfort over conformity, and in the men who learned that defending a woman's autonomy was not weakness, but strength. Their story became legend, simplified and romanticized over time, but at its heart always remained the truth, that love finds its strongest foundation when two people can be completely themselves with each other, breathing easy in the freedom they create together, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with grand gestures, but with one person saying, "I cannot breathe like this anymore," and another person responding, "Then breathe easy with me." The Harper family continued to thrive in Montana, generation after generation, carrying forward the values Caroline and Adam had instilled: independence, education, respect for nature, and the courage to live according to one's own truth rather than society's expectations. The cabin in the mountains remained a sacred place for the family, a refuge where they could reconnect with the land and with the love story that had founded their line. And on quiet summer evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines and the sunset painted the sky in gold and rose, those who listened carefully could almost hear the echo of laughter, of two people who had found in each other the freedom to be exactly who they were meant to be, breathing easy in the wilderness they called home and in the love they had built together, one free breath at a time.